Okay. Imperium Romanum 2, and if you watched any of the playthroughs, pretty much any of it, the rules, anything, you'll know that my opinion in the game has not been very good all across the board. It's a shame, because when I first got this, it seemed so perfect, such a grand idea. Yet, when it comes down to it, it doesn't really work. And by that I mean, it fails to be a particularly enjoyable game, and that's fine on one axis. There may be scenarios that are better than others, but even with the best scenarios, I think, it doesn't feel fun, and I'll talk to you about the whys of that in a moment. But it also ends up having a historical, not just outcomes, but play. Unbelievably a historical play. Now, some of that may be I'm just totally missing something about this game. That has always been my suspicion. And it also may be that I'm missing some brilliant little house rule that would fix it all, or some way of playing it. The missing something about the game, I don't mean so much a rule, I mean that I'm missing a strategy outlook, maybe, for it. Let me talk about the why. So, first of all, the whole thing kind of reminds me of what would happen if Joe Miranda's Ancient Worlds and some of his other designs as well kind of went on steroids. It's this massive quantity of chrome thrown at things in a way that just doesn't quite hang together and doesn't hook you and draw you in, or draw me in the way some of the other big chrome-filled games do. I end up feeling like I've got all these little subsystems that are hanging around, and none of them really connect all that well or make one cohesive whole. It just, feels like a bunch of charts that I gotta parse through. And charts aren't the easiest thing for me to understand, so, in that case, that may be what's going on here, is that in order to assimilate all the information to make wise decisions, it's a lot of effort, and I may not be doing it correctly. Okay, that's one side of it. In terms of the play, there's an incredible amount of. Some people complain about the paperwork on it. And there's a fair amount of paperwork. You have to track the provinces that you own, your treasury, your morale level. Your morale level shifts around a lot. Your treasury may shift around a fair amount. Not as much as your morale does. Every combat, every turn, basically, you're going to have several morale effects that take effect. And these are really, in some ways, there's two key systems that are really kind of odd in this game. The treasury build is not that odd, although the fact that the Romans can't, that mobilization turns are different, and you collect income 4 times a year, but you really only get to mobilize once a year, and there's some ways of kind of twisting around that. Hey, I don't have enough leaders to mobilize everywhere, so some of the forces that I mobilize, I'll be mobilized not at the one time that's common. And then there's, 3 different ways that mobilization occurs, I think. Let's see, there's regular Roman mobilization, which has different variants to it, actually. There's accrual, which is just you get replacement points and troops show up. And then there's this civilized recruitment, which is sort of a mixture of the two. Feels more like the accrual than anything else, but it uses money, which means that civilized powers have money, which has some other uses as well. But anyway, you have a lot of counting in the game. Counting, you have to figure out your supply status. And the supply status, so if you're along the coastlines, your supply status is just fine, peachy, and you can have stacks as big as you like, basically. And then it comes down to whoever has the biggest stack with the bestest modifiers, boom, they just win the battle in general. Or they can expect to. They don't necessarily, but we'll get to that in a moment. But once you walk away from the coast, you start, and that doesn't happen very often. Like, there's some scenarios where it's a big deal. The last one I played, it was a big deal. In the first two, not so much of one. In most of the scenarios, you're not operating a lot in the interior. When you are, you have to deal with a very, very complex movement point cost situation, because essentially, in order to have a big stack, you can only move 4 movement points at a turn because you're hauling your supply wagons with you. And then you have to count up all your stacking points. These are large numbers. Supply wagons can supply 32 stacking points for each level of supply that they expend. So you start to see, wow, you're talking about, 100 stacking points or something like that, and you're counting them up. Some of the units are only 1s, the biggest are basically 4s. So you have these huge stacks of units that you're doing a lot of counting on. Then when you actually engage in combat, you have a huge amount of counting to do, because you have to count up all the factors on all the units, and then do an odds chart thing. Basically, I find for this game, for a single battle where there's 2 people involved, I need to keep track of about 4 numbers, which is more than I should do on calculator. At least when I have only 2 calculators available to me. Like some other games, especially Europa Universalis, I should probably be tracking the combat on a piece of scrap paper instead. That way I can keep track of, what happens. But there's only 1 round of combat. So these calculations are largely just there because the effects of that 1 round of combat are so complex that you have to have all these numbers juggled at once. But they're only 1-use numbers, so it kind of feels silly to write them down and track them the way that I do in the EU type games. The actual combat results table, I don't know, you can't see it there, but it happens to be exceedingly variable and exceedingly deadly. Usually what happens, well, there's a couple of things that can happen. Either nothing happens, or somebody's eliminated. Nothing happens, I guess, means the battle didn't really happen. Somebody's eliminated. There's no in between. There's no forces are badly hurt, maybe due to campaigning near each other, and maybe there were major battles, but there was no climactic battle that every single unit there on the losing side was wiped out. That's a little ahistorical. The combat chart should be a little different in terms of that, but there would be problems in implementing it a little differently, because then you'd have to start taking into account the size of the forces, I think. You could probably play around with it and give, the loser taking a quarter losses, the winner taking nothing. The loser taking half losses, the winner taking half of that, whatever. You could probably work those kind of things into the combat chart. That's not how it's designed. It's got this attempt at simplicity. But anyway, what it all means is you have to count up the factors that one side lost, if they lost. You count up all their strength points, and then you apply that damage to the other side. And then you count up the stacking points again and see what the morale is like. So there's just all of this calculation there. And then there's this geometric calculation that's going on. Again, if you're on the coast, that's not a big deal. But if you're not on the coast, you have to start worrying about how can I position my units so that they can mutually support each other and intercept, so that I can get everything together where the supplies is, or as much as I can supply where the supplies is, in case the enemy attacks me. And where can I position my forces so that I can intercept them as they're coming in a place that'll hurt them. There's things that I don't even account for, and maybe at a higher level of play these are possible, coming in from multiple directions to prevent retreats from going in different directions. I find that too difficult. You split your forces, somebody's going to go smash one of the forces. because the biggest and the bestest is the winner. And the biggest is part of biggest and bestest, right? It's a big part of it because it gets you your base odds. Anyway, it's very, very easy where you're screwing around with, trying to get yourself lodged into a port that you can use when you don't have supply from ports, or trying to position yourself in the interior, where you can make a huge mistake and basically either, just lose on that battle, but that would be easy to roll back. But put yourself in a position where on the next battle, you're going to lose. And the reason that may happen is because you have to supply your troops during the enemy turn if he attacks you. Which means if you're having to supply using wagons and stuff, you may end up in a position where you used up your supply on the attack, and now you get attacked and you don't have enough food, and your whole army basically dies before the battle. So that's a little wanky. But then with all this care and consideration going into trying, to make sure that you don't lose your forces or lose the game on one stupid mistake, the actual combat results are really variable. And they are made more variable by the introduction of certain optional rules, for example, in particular calling on gods, which can just knock you out of the game because you rolled a 1 when you called on your gods. So obviously that's something you don't want to do very often, but when you are going to do it, it's probably the biggest battle of the game. It's one of those battles that's going to decide the whole game. So you increase the luck factor on those key battles because possibly both sides are going to be rolling on the gods table. The supply and morale systems seem to be the heart of things that go wrong with the game. So the supply system, again, you can mass your entire force, however big it is, as long as you got ports. It doesn't matter if you control the ocean, it doesn't matter anything like that. As long as you've got connected, ports that can connect across the same sea zone, hey, you're fine. Okay. That doesn't seem reasonable. An unlimited amount of supplies can go through those ports. That doesn't seem reasonable. And again, you can make some house rolls to fix this, right? But it wouldn't necessarily make the game more fun, but it might fix the historical believability. And then the morale system, the morale system forces you to fight each round in the summer. If you don't, you take a 5-point morale penalty, which is fairly big. Losing a small battle is probably about that same cost. What this means, and retreating before combat is a 5-point loss in morale, no matter how big your force. Your whole army retreats before combat, yep, you got a problem. But it's worth saving your army. A small force is going to retreat. Well, now you're looking at, do I have a chance of winning it? Because then I'll stay, because the morale is incredibly important. In fact, if your morale goes low enough to 0, you probably are knocked out of the game. And there may be scenarios where you're not, but I'm not aware of. And that's it. And so that's pretty huge. With all that said, if the damn thing had campaigns or even mini campaigns that allowed you to transfer what information was in one scenario to the next scenario when they're nearby in time, or some overarching framework that you would play that was kind of light, but the lightest that probably would do it justice is Republic of Rome, you would end up with a situation that I would still be attracted to. Now, maybe by this point, if that had always been here, I wouldn't be anymore. Maybe I would have given up. But as of right now, I would still love to see that. The funny thing about it all is that a lot of the things that I kind of hit this for and don't like about it apply to some of the games that I love the most. And I played the crap out of this thing in the early days, probably for some of the same reasons that I play things like EU and La Grande Guerre and even La Révolution Française. I'm picking on AWE here because they tend to have games where I don't believe the history. I have to say this much, the play is never as painful as this to me, but there may be specific reasons for that as to what things I mind versus other things, and this game just really grinds my gears in a bad way in terms of like all that counting in terms of geographical positioning, using the hex grid to optimize my chance of, being able to intercept and protect my units and everything. That kind of thinking doesn't, neither the thinking nor the counting, mechanical, mental mechanical aspect is something that I particularly like. The other games tend to have very complex systems, but they all feel like they hang together better. But more importantly, they don't tend to annoy the piss out of me the way this does. It just, some people don't mind counting lots of factors. There's a reason I don't play the big operational games all that much. I don't like counting all kind of factors and coming up with an odds ratio. One of the big questions in it, by the rules, and I'm not sure how many times in the past I saw it this way, but by the rules, everything's supposed to be kind of hidden. Your stacks, the opponent can only look at the top unit on your stack. And you get to choose what your top unit is. So you can hide your leaders in your stack. You can make it almost like a block game in terms of the mystery of what's there. If the stack's on the board, the stack I think is visible on the board. So there's this pile. You have an idea of how big a force it is. But you don't really know what it consists of. So all the heavy units could be in one stack and the light units in another, and you've got kind of a shell game going on. I don't like shell games. I don't like guessing games. I don't like shit like that. I don't believe it necessarily does a particularly good job of reflecting the historical situation. That's not to say that there aren't times of pure strategic surprise, but what it is to say is that the game's other mechanisms actually handle strategic surprise fairly well. The interception die rolls, the force march die rolls. These things, when you're playing not on the coastline, can actually provide, and if you're playing on the coastline, none of it matters. You draw your big stack and just overrun the enemy. You hit them with what you can. And if I'm wrong about that, man, the more people who can tell me that I'm wrong and why, especially the why, if you can explain the why. I know one guy who says, oh, you want to split your stacks and do all this. And I'm like, well, I look at it, and if I've got split stacks, boom, and the other guy can get his whole force in, he kills me. There are some intricacies relating to the pulsing of the interceptions and stuff that make it make sense to split stacks and come at somebody from multiple angles. That's something different. But anyway, it just feels to me like there's not a lot to fix here in the end. You almost have to redesign the whole game. And it's a pity because the research effort that went into the economic systems, this is the biggest thing. It's like, I wouldn't even think this was here terribly much. But yeah, I mean, Nafi goes into what kind of effort he had to put into, not just in terms of when cities are disappearing and reappearing, but coming up with what the appropriate supply levels are for different types of terrain, what the economics are for different regions in terms of what they could produce in terms of military forces. And for the Romans, there's sort of multiple layers to this. There's the how much money does it provide and how many troops does it provide. Nice thing, kind of like Empires and Arms, money and manpower, except it's more complicated here, at least on the manpower side. It tells you which actual units you can rebuild in that area each year. And that must have been a humongous amount of effort. I found the combination of lots of modifiers to combat. It's not a huge amount, but it's a fair amount. When you start counting in, you have a combat efficiency rating, which doesn't change for a power. You have arms morale, you have leadership, you have some terrain, which is kind of buried in the rules in a place that I didn't see it very well. You have, wow, I diverged from where I was trying to go. You have the gods, you just have all these different things. You have, if you're playing with optional rules, you have the gods and you have archers and cavalry. All these different little modifiers to an odds chart. That combination I don't really like. I don't really like modifiers, to tell you the truth, but if I'm playing a game that's like a die roll, lots of modifiers on it, I kind of want the odds chart to be built into that in some way. That just pleases me somehow. It seems cleaner, but... So the thing I was trying to say that I lost my train on was, if you've got the hidden units, you've got this shell game thing going on. If you don't have the hidden units, you have this, and that would be modding the game essentially. You have this tremendous calculation problem in front of you of, okay, what are my odds if I hit them with this? I have to balance the odds I get, and again, not on the coast. Coast is easy. The game just, plays itself. Not the odd. What are the odds that I'm hitting based on how much supply I can get there? And then there's all kind of trickery with the trying to use the interception rules to your best advantage and everything like that. One of the problems with all of this is the hidden game. It doesn't work very well solo. Now, this is surprisingly a game I was able to get people to play who weren't even wargamers. And a fair number of them, they'd play Britannia, they'd play Civilization, but they wouldn't sit down and play, I don't know. They wouldn't want to play Third Reich, right? Some of them would play Whiff, though, for some unknown reason. It's like, I don't know why, but Whiff had this magical effect on people. Whiff and Empires in Arms. It's like the two Rollins games. I don't know. Anyway. It just seems to me that those two subsystems need some work. And I'm not sure quite what to do. I mean, morale effects, if you kind of watered them down in some cases, I think things might work out better. Because one of the problems is the scenarios very often, we didn't see this in the last one because it has an artificial thing to prevent combat between 3 or 4 of the players. But one of the things that happens is people just find their natural enemy that they can beat up on. They go beat up on them, and whoever wins out of that battle comes out of it, maybe weakened, maybe not, but with lots more morale. And you just see powers fall like mad early in the scenario. And then usually the whole scenario goes pretty quickly because somebody gets so weakened but survives, and then they can get stomped on or whatever. And it's just almost none of these play out in the length of time that the scenario is supposed to play out, and in the length of time that they historically took, which I always find kind of problematic. I don't know. Let's talk about components, I guess, because I should always look at those. I wanted to do it first because I like to do it first, get the unimportant stuff out of the way. The components on this edition are kind of crappy. And that's not surprising. It's a certain era and it's West End games. Glossy map, kind of ugly, garish. Lots and lots of very, very thin, glossy counters. Now, their thinness is kind of neat. I know a lot of people are like, oh crap, thin counters, we can't do that, right? That sucks. Yeah, thin, glossy counters make up for some of the error of glossiness because they slip under your fingernail very easily. It's easy to grab stacks with the tweezers. I actually find them easier to operate with than thicker glossy counters. But they're obviously very, very, cheaply made. Bunches of charts. 2 copies of this, several pages of charts. Some of them cover the eras. We also have in the rules book these maps which you have to kind of get used to for each scenario, which are going to tell you what each province is in terms of whether there's roads, which will affect your movement rate, and whether or not it's cultivated, which affects the supply that, how big an army you can just handle in different seasons. You have a huge scenario book. What is that? 33 real scenarios and then 2 little introductory scenarios. Here. The errata is not very big. About this much for the actual rules. Half a page or so. And honestly, I don't know if it's... There's a couple of things that are just errors, but that's okay. But none of them are too big a deal. The scenarios have a fair number of errors on them, however. Not all of them seem to have been caught, and there may be things in the rulebook that haven't been caught. And I don't think there was a lot of support done. I know a lot of people use house rules in this. I don't know the extent of the house rules they use. I don't think you can play it without some sort of house ruling, but some of it may just seem obvious. Whoever writes the rules and teaches the game just teaches the house rules in there without really realizing what they're doing. Yeah, it was an incredibly compelling game for me. I've certainly got my money's worth in plays out of it over the years. I don't know if that would be, nowadays I would pick something up like this and stop about where I did without, diving into it the way I did. But there was so little on the ancient period. And this felt like maybe, just maybe it worked. My conclusion is that it doesn't work. That it doesn't work as a historical simulation. That the motivations baked into those basic supply and morale system are such that things don't, you don't fight out the war the way they historically would be fought out. And they end too quickly because of it. And the combination of the supply system, all those counters with all those factors, everything like that just ends up being a painful game to actually play in terms of the mental mechanical aspects of it. Between those two things, it's really hard to recommend this at all. But yeah, if it had the campaign game, still. And I've wanted to fix it. The problem is the feeling that you're tweaking something that was, so heavily researched and this is a second edition, the first edition was broken, so they made the second edition to fix those errors. Well, it doesn't feel like it fixes them either. And now, from what I can tell of the upcoming edition, they're keeping the rules for this, pretty much. There's one small change on the supply system, but it's just to make it non-deterministic. So you can't just figure out, I'll be fed there. But it's going to be close enough to deterministic. I assume. I haven't seen it, so I don't know. That I don't think they're fixing the core problems with the game. And you got to really question how much it's worth grabbing. Now, I don't know of anything else that tries to do what this does, though, which is covering so many of the major campaigns throughout such a large period of time. In some ways, what it tries to do hurts it. So the map becomes more difficult to cope with because you have the changing what's cultivated, what's not, where are the roads, where are they not, what cities exist, which don't, stuff like that. That makes the game more complicated in terms of, being able to assess the board correctly. But yeah, it's an audacious effort, but it's, in the end, it feels like a failure, and the fact that it's a failure and it's not fun, the fact that it's not fun to play is part of the failure, that it's painful to play. I'm not going to say it's not entirely fun, because like other big strategic games that give a lot of detail, it gives you one hell of a good narrative. And, you know, that's what I come to them for, and I'm tempted to keep playing, or was tempted to keep playing. Not now, because there's a high price to every scenario you play in terms of sorting and setting up. It's not a huge price, but it's fairly high. Especially when you look at how quickly it's over. Now, it took me a long time to play it out, but I found that when I brought this to my normal gaming group, teaching the rules and getting it played, it could generally get done in a 6 to 8 hour slot. Just because the scenarios are over so fast. Now, that may be because these were other people who, you know, these were unskilled players, completely unskilled for the most part, or they had played it a couple of times before but didn't remember it very well. And I certainly shouldn't expect strategic, you know, brilliance and insight into the system from them that I haven't been able to extract over years and years and many, many plays. And some people seem to be fine and dandy with it, which I don't know, you know, but people like Pax Romana too, and I don't feel like that's, you know, as horribly lacking a game, but it certainly doesn't feel like the kind of detail I was kind of hoping for when I first, you know, started researching it. And then, you know, from what people were saying, I think it's just the dearth and maybe of ancient games, and then also an unwillingness to cope with detail. Well, this is the one that's meant for the great detail, and I would suggest, if you're thinking about this, yeah, maybe, but make sure you get the GMT Rise of the Roman Republic and Carthage ones first. Play those. They're much more interesting systems. Similar, you know, they could be done on the same scale in terms of an individual campaign taking that long. What they can't do, because they represent a single situation, a single slice of time, what they can't do is give you all the different periods and all the different changes. But you see later, though, you know, there were a lot of changes in, say, the period of time that Europa Universalis covers. Not quite as much time as this, not quite as many severe changes, but it just kind of glosses over them and says, you know, they're not that important. I think the ones here are more important in terms of the road and cultivation, because you don't have barbarian provinces turning into fully civilized Roman integrated places and stuff like that. So, yeah. I think the game could have been better done breaking it into several smaller games with a little bit more emphasis and attempt to cover those periods with more care. I've heard people say the late period games are even worse historically in terms of, you know, when you start adding the heavy cabin stuff, that they start acting particularly strange. I don't know about that. I've played them, but I'm not comfortable enough with the era to be able to distinguish too much between different eras in the Roman period. All that I know is that the core seems so ahistorical that, you know, I mean, no matter how many little earrings you dangle off that pig, the lipstick still doesn't look good. Nah, I don't know. I mean, it's just unsatisfying, but I knew it when I walked into it, and I'm glad I'm done, damn it.